Today is November 29th, 1974, and I'm interviewing Rabbi Herman Dikar, D-I-C-K-E-R, at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. And the first question I wanted to ask was, where and when did you first encounter Jewish survivors of the Holocaust? Who were these people? Were they concentration camp victims or individuals who hid during the war?
I'm very glad to be able to share some of my experiences with Mr. Grobman, and I'm hopeful that his work will help to keep alive, so to speak, the experiences that we chaplains had right after World War II. But before the end of World War II, which was sometimes in June 1945, I had occasion to meet people who were in hiding.
You're talking about June 44?
The end of World War II.
Oh, the end of World War. Oh, yes.
Is June 45.
45.
Our division, I was assigned to a combat division, meaning that it was one of the forward division of Patton's Third Army, and my first encounter with Jews were, let me say, they were twofold. First, I had a very, very terrifying experience with the Jews in Paris. And you probably know that General de Gaulle did not permit any Allied troops to enter Paris except French forces. So therefore, although our division was very close, much closer than the French divisions, we had to go around Paris and move forward. However, after a week or so, our rear echelon was allowed to move through Paris. And I went to Paris twice on our way throughout France. The first time I was looking for some Jews, and I found quite a few. I don't know, numbers can help, but I saw there was a shortage of food because the transportation had broken down due to the retreat of the Germans and the advance of the Allied troops. And so seeing that the Jews had a need for food, I approached our mess sergeant and asked him whether he had some of these crackers left, which were a part of the sea ration issued to the troops. And none of the troops liked these rations, so he was loaded up with boxes after box of sea rations, crackers. So I asked him whether he would let me take my trailer. We chaplains had a jeep and trailer, which gave us a chance to be independent, and we didn't have to account always for where we were going and what we were doing. So I loaded up this trailer. When I say I mean my assistant was a Jewish boy too, and his name was Ed Shapiro, S-H-A-P-E-R-O-W, who was a very, very good boy. He also could play the organ, which was important for field services. So I said, Ed, let's load up as much as we can. So we loaded up and moved into the Jewish quarters. But somehow or other it got around, maybe the people knew what we were carrying, and quickly a group of Jews, men, women, gathered around the jeep, and I couldn't move any forward and it's the first time that I met people who hadn't eaten for 3 to 4 days, and they were no longer human beings, they were just animals, and I had hoped to be able to distribute these rations through the Jewish organizations, but that was impossible because the people sort of piled in and surrounded our truck, our Jeep, and our Jeep and our whatever, our trailer, yes. So I said to Ed, unload the trailer as quickly as you can and use your gun shooting in the air in order to get out. Otherwise I was been afraid that people would really have done us physical damage, not because they hated us, but because they wanted to get a share of these sea rations. This was a very, very terrifying experience, which I will not forget. Then, number 2, as we moved through France, I heard that quite a few, again statistics I don't have, Jews were hidden by French people, and with the protection, we must give credit, of the Catholic Church and the Catholic priests who knew that these were Jews, but who certified them also as human, as people, so they could get rations, food. And one time I came to a home and I knocked at the door, and I wanted to look for Jews, but they, seeing the uniform, they were so scared. So I spoke to them in Yiddish, and I said, "Ich bin a Yid," and so of course it was still a little bit stiff, but at least they were no longer afraid. It must be that French people have to be given credit for having helped the Jews, not so much the top people like General de Gaulle, but the lower echelon. Excuse me.
Can you be a little more specific about dates?
Well, dates, you see, all these experiences that I'm relating are experiences which took care during the war. Now Paris was taken late in 1944, and our division being a D-Day plus 30 division, infantry division, we did not get into Germany until 1945, spring of 1945. So what I'm telling you is the time, the advance of the Allies from the coast of France to Germany. And so don't forget that in December of 1944, the Germans made a last big counterattack in the Battle of the Bulge, and they almost broke through. And if it hadn't been for the fortitude and the strength of the American forces, the Hitler forces might have advanced and driven the Allied forces back. So I'm still in 1944. I met Jews in Paris, as I said. I met Jews in France, and then of course came when we got into Germany, we began hearing about the concentration camps. Nobody, of course, none of the Germans knew that concentration camps existed. None of the Germans were Nazis. None of the Germans were for Hitler. They were all very, very good to everybody, including the Jews. My first experience was with moving around, and I was sent officially by the headquarters of Third Army to visit various camps like Dachau Mauthausen, and which was in Austria, or in camp in Linz. But before coming to my visitations of these camps, again, I like to give credit to our forward elements, like our medical battalion came across a group of young girls, young women, who had been on a death march. What is a death march? A death march was a march that was organized by the retreating Germans who, seeing that they are losing the East and they're losing the West, they were taking all their prisoners and having them march back and back. And of course, there was no proper food and no proper care, so we came upon an area called Lidice, which is near the Czech border. Still, the war hadn't ended. I'm still before the end of World War II in Germany, and we found, our medical battalion found about 150 girls who were living, they were not living. We had to carry them out, they were sick. We carried out 4 girls on one stretcher, and the medical battalion, which was commanded by a Jewish officer, but I don't want to say that only the Jewish officers and the Jewish men helped, they all helped. The American army was very, very generous. We took out these girls, 150 of them, and tried to give them a little bit of food and try to bring them back to life. But before I did that, I was told by the girls that some of them had died on the road. They were marching, of course, from Poland into the southern part of Germany, and outside of this little community, they said there were girls just on the side and not properly buried. And so what I did, I went outside, I contacted the mayor, I had them dig up these graves, because you still saw arms and feet sticking out, and had them bring them into town, and had the mayor organize his German community to show them. That's what I wanted. I wanted them to see what was done, and so whatever we found, again, I don't know numbers, maybe 20 or 30 or 40 young women who were dead, we buried them, and we had the community, the German community, march by and see what the Hitler forces had done. So this is an experience. It's one experience. Another experience with the girls that they were in a hospital, and we fixed them up with food. And I remember the first Friday night when I came to visit them, and they had already recuperated a little bit. And when I remember, I brought them candles so that excuse me, so they could light the candles for Friday night, and it was really crying, and they were crying about the situation in which they found themselves, crying about their fate, and crying again, having a little bit of hope for the future. It's interesting, to me interesting, that when I asked them, what do you want? The first thing they asked, they wanted a comb and a mirror, because they had come back to life again, and their hair was fallen out, and they didn't know how they looked. Now that was the period in which our division was immediately involved in. Now, but then we were down in the south of Germany, around Munich, in the Munich area.
When?
In 1945,
Yeah.
and the area which was commanded by General Patton, who was a very, very good soldier and a very, very good general, but he lacked a little bit compassion, and he wasn't. He was very much criticized, particularly by his commanding officer, General Eisenhower, who was the first one to. There's a chaplain by the name of Chaplain Schechter, who went into the Buchenwald, which was in the north, and Eisenhower saw that, and he brought in correspondence from the United States and from other parts of the world, so they should be able to see with their own eyes what was done, because you really, it is very hard to describe. It is these gas ovens and how they looked, and the half-starved and half-sick people, and the fences around the barbed wire. So Eisenhower put some pressure on Patton to do something more for his for the DPs that were in his area. So the army chaplain asked me.
Who is that?
The 3rd Army chaplain.
Do you remember his name?
Yeah, sure. Chaplain Neil O'Neill, a Catholic chaplain, and I was one of the few chaplains in that area. But so he sent me to make an official trip, and I was going around. Well, I would say it was somewhere in May and June.
1945.
Yeah, because the reason why I'm remembering it so well, because our division was scheduled to go to the Far East, because the war over, and they still had expected to have, so our division was scheduled to Far East. So a personal matter, I didn't want to go to the Far East for 2 reasons. A very personal one. I was engaged to my wife, who was a girl in England, and we had set the date of our wedding as July 29th. And secondly, I wanted to be close to a place where I could help our own people. And so I had a good friend in the personnel office, and we were already alerted to go to the Far East. And so on the afternoon, Thursday afternoon, he said, called me, said, do you still want to go to the 1st Division? I was in the 5th Division. Of course I wanted to, and so we packed up, and I moved out as fast as I could. So I was able, A, to get married, and B, to be able to help, be in touch with people who needed me. Now, I see I must give credit to the Army, that the Army, after a while, established a group of chaplains called DP chaplains, whose sole duty was, there were about 10, to act as liaison between the Jews and the Army, because the Army was the one in control of the military government was in control. They had the problems of these.
This was in 1946.
1945. It could be 1946. I'll tell you why. Again, I'll tell you why, because we had our regular duties. I mean, you had the regular duties to take care of your Jewish men and activities, and what the normal duties of chaplains are and were. On the other hand, there were these problems that the Army had. The Army had to take care of the needs of these displaced persons, and they had to take, because they had to provide them with food, they had to provide them with shelter, they had to see that they had to see that they should not get out. They didn't want them to get out in the community, because the communities were all destroyed and there was nothing they could get from the communities. Only later on, as Germany recovered, some of the DPs began to sort of integrate themselves into the community, and but up until the time, let's say 47 or 48, most of the DPs stayed in camps, and the camps were under military supervision. I don't know exactly when the AJDC, the American Joint Distribution, came into the operation, but I think it took a few months after the end of World War II. In other words, if I were to say they started operating in 46, I would not be far wrong, because they were all waiting in Paris to get in, but nobody, the military authorities didn't want to give permission, because they had to get organized. They had to organize military governments, and aside from the military governments, they had troops, and but they started to come in, and of course then they took over the major operation of liaison between military government and DPs, but always with the help of the chaplains, depending upon the individual chaplain. Now, again, a personal note, having lived in Germany, I wasn't born there, but having lived in Germany, I felt very, very close in every way, and my own parents were deported from Germany, so I felt very close to the needs. I had perhaps a better understanding than some of the people who had not grown up in Europe, and so I felt that I could do a better job by staying in Germany. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now you were talking about your trip.
Yeah.
Perhaps we should get back to that for a moment and be more specific about the trip.
Well,
you went to.
I went, for instance, I remember Mauthausen. Mauthausen was a sort of on a mountain, and the people had to walk up and down. And I of course you talk to the people.
When did you get to Mauthausen?
Mauthausen I got early. I got to Mauthausen very, very early. I think it was in August of 1945.
Right. Now, were there other chaplains there before you?
Oh, no, this I don't know. I mean, very few of us were assigned to infantry divisions. But as the troops began to come in, to pour in, there were more Jewish chaplains involved in that program, and
did the inmates say that they had seen American Jews before? Were you the first American Jew that they had seen?
Well, this was never that exact in these terms was told to me, but they all knew about America, and they all were, of course, appreciative of what was done for them, and they quickly organized themselves.
Before you came or right after?
Well, they had, you see, this I don't know because I didn't experience personally, but there was always an organization within these camps, and unfortunately there were some what you might are known as capos. They are the one who cooperated with the Germans for the sake of survival, and there were some Jews, I would say the hardest and the most insensitive and the strongest Jews survived. The other Jews who were not as tough and perhaps who were not as willing to cooperate, they died, because I know there are many DPs who survived the war by not admitting that they are Jews. So they worked. That goes for men and goes for women. But I didn't want to go into the history of the individual.
So what happened when you went into Mauthausen?
Well, I would have to approach you, what can you do for us? And we always came with supplies. And
the army had had given them supplies up to this point.
The army, yes, the army had, you see, then UNRWA started coming in.
Before you?
No, the UNRWA is the same. AJDC was the time sequence. No, the UNRWA came in after the army came in. The army were the first.
But when, what was your part in that?
Individually, I cannot say whether came in there before or they came in before. The only thing is that what can be said, that when the army came in, the army was an organization.
Right.
Whereas the UNRWA was at the beginning, the UNRWA was just getting organized, and although they had been operating in France, but in Germany they didn't have as many supplies handy, and then some of them had simple speech difficulties. You send in an UNRWA, of course the Jewish people, most of them knew Yiddish or learned Yiddish in the course of their operations, but those who spoke Yiddish and spoke German, they could of course do a much better job. So I still have friends here in New York whom I was able to help, and so they managed. It's amazing the vitality that they had, and after all, they were close to death, and then they came back to life. And I remember I was then stationed with the first division I was stationed in Ansbach, which is in Bavaria, and again. There were camps, and then people came to the chaplain. They were interested. They came to the chaplain, and to his activities, to services, and then of course began the big problem of emigration. What to do with them? Nobody wanted to stay. Nobody wanted to stay in a camp, because the camp reminded them constantly of the experiences they had during the Hitler period. So then began, they were getting back to more normal life. They're preparing for immigration. We had immigration to, of course, to Israel, which most of if Israel had been open at that time, Israel did not exist. But if we had a state, Israel in 45, 46, and 47, all the bulk of the DPs would have left right away and gone to Israel. All right, am I on the right track, or?
Yeah. Well, I want to finish one area and then go on to the next.
Right.
We were talking about getting back again to this trip. Was there anything else in seeing Mauthausen and seeing Dachau? Anything else which you did as a chaplain, which was very unique? How did you help them out?
Well, first of all, you help them out by just being there.
Right, okay.
That's number one. Seeing somebody in uniform, who are uniform to them, of course, meant death in the past. All of a sudden, they see somebody in uniform who speaks Yiddish and who brings food and who takes letters. They should go to their relatives in the United States.
So you were involved in letters?
I know my own cousin came to me who had been in concentration camp and found out, and then of course one of the things, I don't know whether we should mention it or not, but there was one law that only those were classified DPs who were in Germany before December 25th, 1945. But this is sort of was a date, I would say, arbitrarily fixed, and you couldn't blame people for proving whether right or wrong that they had been in Germany in that period, because that enabled them to come to America quicker, because President Truman had allowed to bring in 100,000 DPs. So what's the definition of a DP? Supposing he came from Poland or from Russia in 1946. Wasn't he a DP? Wasn't he a Jew that could be helped? That had to be helped. So we all helped, and the consuls understood and they looked the other way, and the way
so you helped Jews get to America.
Helping Jews to the America, which was Now
so you had you had correspondence which you collected. You gave them food. You helped them to get to America.
We helped them. Yeah, we also helped them. Then the picture. I had nothing to do with as you asked me before, collecting guns. For Israel, I had nothing to do with collecting money for Israel, because these were, I would say, underground activities, and I would say my effectiveness as an army chaplain who could go in and ask things legitimately would have been, I felt, would have been curtailed and reduced if I had involved myself in activities which, from an objective point of view, could be considered illegal.
Now, did anyone approach you during this period of time?
No, nobody approached me, because chaplains had no access to guns, you see.
Well, there were chaplains who did collect.
Could very well be.
No, fine. I was just interested whether anyone had ever asked you to do this. Any member from Jewish agent, not the Jewish agency.
No, the Jewish agency can't be.
Excuse me, but from Palestine, from the Jewish Brigade, had ever asked you to participate in any of this sort?
No, the first time that we had experience with I personally had the experience when we began to let me say I had one that's a personal story. One of the great rabbis in Europe was a rabbi by the name of Yechiel Weinberg, and he had been my teacher in Berlin, and I met him after the war in a hospital near Nuremberg. He had been considered a political prisoner, and I helped him get out of this hospital into Munich, and from Munich the AJDC helped him get to Switzerland. And in other words, we helped individuals, but not on a large scale.
Right. Now, were you involved in packages?
Yes, you're right.
Specific about that.
Yes, we received packages from, that's right. I mean, I forgot about that. Yes, we received a tremendous amount of packages for individuals and generally speaking.
So how did that develop?
After all, you had correspondence. Eisenhower, as I told you, when they went into Mauthausen, he brought in correspondence, and the correspondence starting to write back, and the story began to unfold, and you know the generosity of Americans, and I don't know how the Jewish community was organized, but packages were sent to those who could use them.
So how packages were sent to you?
Packages were sent to me. Care of Chaplain Dicker.
But how did they know to send it to you?
They could. Where do they get the address? All you have to do, call up the Jewish Welfare Board.
No, but I mean, In other words, you didn't ask your Jewish personnel
to ask for their people. I know some boys did that individually, but I
you
didn't
didn't
do it. I
make
didn't
any,
do it in an
general,
organized. No, I didn't do
I
it in an organized.
So
manner.
there was a spontaneous outpouring of these packages to you, and what
Yeah.
did you do with them?
Well, you see, these camps became quickly organized. People organized themselves, and they had people who were running. I mean, were in charge of the internal operations, and the packages were turned over to them, and they distributed amongst the needy.
Fine. Were you ever reprimanded by the American Army for your activities with the DPs?
No, I wasn't reprimanded, but that's a little later. I was in 1940. It was in 1949. It's a little jump, but I'll come back to the other in periods in between. In 1949, when we had already a Jewish state, my wife and I went escorted DPs to Israel, and I didn't have any civilian clothes, so I was wearing army trousers and an army shirt, and I didn't think anything of it because it is not a full uniform. Then after that, when I got back from Israel, I was transferred to Vienna, and the first letter that I found on my desk was a letter from I think it must have been from the Army or from the CIA, saying that you were seen in Israel in out of uniform or wearing army clothes, and this should not have been done because they didn't want to maintain. They always wanted to maintain that they are neutral. They are not in Israel just to, that we are not, American forces were not in Israel to help. I stayed in Germany till 1900, beginning of 1947, and then I went back back to Germany in 1948. And there is where the problem of immigration became very great.
Mm-hmm. Now, before we get to that,
right?
Let's see if we can exhaust all of the other periods.
Yeah.
What were you involved with the Jewish Agency at all during this?
Did you?
During this
just a minute.
Sure.
Just.
Talking about the Jewish Agency, were you involved in them during your early
No,
period?
I wasn't involved in the Jewish Agency, but I was involved in the HADC, because the HADC, being an American organization,
yeah, but you're talking about the from 1940.
Well, you see, the HADC, of course, gave up their responsibility from the time the people moved to Israel.
Yeah.
So I saw the Jewish Agency people in Munich.
Mm-hmm. But you were never called upon by them to do any work as a chaplain?
No, I did not. No, I was not.
All right. What about, were you involved in Aliyah Bet at all?
No, I wasn't involved in that.
Okay. Now, what about your relationship with the JDC and during the early period?
The relationship with the JDC was a very excellent one, because the HJDC they were trained. They're a trained organization. Most of them are American, with American background. They had the facilities, and they had the requirements necessary to bring displaced persons back to life and back to countries of emigration, and they.
Who were you involved with? Remember?
I know one who is now the executive vice president of the HAC, Sam Haber, who was in Munich at the time. But there were other people there involved. Sal Shapiro, who was working for the chaplain for the HADC, and you see the HADC provided many things, including cultural. And for instance, it's not too much known that the HADC printed a shas at I don't know exactly how they did it, but I think they had the help of the army too. I still have a copy. So in other words, they provided the not only the food and clothing, but also the spiritual support.
Is this what you're talking about, the one that Rabbi Oscar Lifshitz was involved with?
Mike, he was involved. His major activities were in Austria, and Mike, he was. I don't know. Have you interviewed him?
Yes.
Well, all right, then you know what.
Fine. We'll get to that. But what I'm particularly interested in was the relationship between the JDC and the chaplain. How did you work together with them? Do you remember experiences which would indicate the type of activity that you were involved in with them?
With the JDC, well, let me explain to you. For instance, DP was in trouble.
Right.
He came to HADC. For instance, he was in trouble for having done something which objectively could be considered black market.
Right.
Well, the HADC worker did not have the same entree to the military government as the chaplain.
Right.
So he called up and said, look, can you help this fellow, and can you explain to him, can you explain to the government, to the military authorities, that this man is not a professional Ganef or professional rabbi, but that he is just trying to get on his feet again, and that was in that manner we helped the HADC, because we represented the organization that supervised.
Now, was there any other ways in which you worked with them? Do you remember specific incidents? With the JDC.
The JDC, I would say the importance of the JDC increased by the measure and in the manner that the importance of the army decreased in terms of work with and for the displaced persons.
Yeah, no, but
our person,
yeah.
I mean, we had good relations, but
how would you characterize the relationship between yourself as a chaplain and the JDC?
Excellent, because they're very good relations, because they're the ones, after all, they came in and they organized, you see, by that time.
Was your role complementary to theirs?
Well, there was so much to do that everything, yeah.
Everybody was needed.
Sure, everybody was needed. So I think.
So you worked in concert with them.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, in Munich, for instance, also in Munich, it was the headquarters. We went up there, and what we could do, and where we could help, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. And they readily called upon you for.
Well, depending again on the case, depending again on the chaplain, individual chaplain, depending again on the circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
To call on for help, and it must be carefully done.
What about your experiences with UNRWA? Do you have any personal experiences that you can remember?
No. I had a better relationship with HADC than with UNRWA, because UNRWA, the bulk of the UNRWA personnel was not Jewish. The bulk of the UNRWA personnel was not only involved with Jewish displaced persons, but there were thousands and thousands of other displaced persons. So therefore the relationship was not as close.
I see.
Yeah.
Now, You mentioned that you were called upon to smooth the relations between the DPs and the U.S. Army
Yeah.
with regard to some of the blackmail activities.
Black market.
Black market.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Black market activities. Now, was there any other type of activities that you were involved with in smoothing the relations between the DPs and the United States Army?
No, I mean, we try to present the DPs in the best light possible, but it wasn't always possible because some of them had gone through experiences of World War II, and their relationship with German was very. There was no relationship. After all, the Germans had killed their parents, and they didn't hesitate. They had no feeling of any kind of a responsibility that they had for the Germans, and to take something from the Germans or steal something from the Germans or in any way benefit from their existence.
Now, were you involved in working with other Jewish chaplains on the question of Jewish chaplains?
Well, we were involved to the extent that we had, of course, telephone communications. We had meetings from time to time. We had, again, and I must point out that about these 10 chaplains, that, and I must mention this Eisenhower, in order to understand, in order to be able to do more for the Jews, he established the office of the advisor on Jewish affairs. And the first advisor on Jewish affairs is now the former Judge Rifkin, Salman Rifkin. And after that, Rabbi Philip Bernstein came in, and he stayed in Germany from 45 to about 47, and did a wonderful job in helping the people, allowing the people to. They wanted to close the end of 45. They wanted to close the admission of the DPs into Germany, and he convinced the general. It was at that time, it was, I think, General McNally, to keep the borders open, and so we had the people come in, and we escorted these trains. They came coming from Austria.
Were you involved in escorting?
Oh yes.
This is
escorting, where we were involved.
Be as specific as possible about this.
About escorting the trains.
How did this happen?
You say everything was the army said you have to be on this and this day. The train left, let's say Salzburg. As a rule, we always try to pass Munich at night, because everybody wanted to go to Munich. This is the München. Right. That was the heaven on earth for most of DPs. If they had known that the train was near Munich, they would have gotten off. And then, I'm glad you remind me. One time, I escorted a train into an area where they were supposed to go, and there were about 300 people. Now, what do I talk about? More. I don't know how many. There were about 1,000 or 1,500 people. And when the people came and saw the conditions of the camp, they refused to get out of the train.
Do you remember where this was?
I don't remember where. Yes, it was. I was stationed in Heidelberg at that time, and we were for 3 days. There was a conversation going on. The men just refused to go into the place because they said we were long enough in a concentration camp. We don't want to go into concentration camp. And the army chaplain came up Father Martin. He talked to the DPs, and then the general came. General, don't know the name. The general came up because you see, I mean, here they were the people. How can you live in a train? And eventually, finally, they went into the camp.
Well, what convinced them?
What convinced them? You see, after all, you need to eat, and the physical arrangement. We were forming committees and were showing them the camp, and we were trying to improve.
Do you think that your being there was helpful?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Oh yeah, and it was very helpful because otherwise they said they just would have refused. And then,
in other words, you provided a certain assurance.
I provided an assurance. I got the backing of the army that they shouldn't get dissatisfied.
I see.
Yeah, after all, the army. In the beginning, the American army was very, very, let's say, friendly, and their attitude was positive. But as the months went by, and as the years went by, and things began to become normal, they began to like the Germans much more than they liked the Jews. And there was fraternization, of course. And of course it was forbidden, but chocolate went very far, cigarette went very far, and the DPs became a nuisance to the army because they, some of them were weren't the best of behavior. Some wanted to go to America, they couldn't go to America, and some. So it became more and more of a problem to take care of the DPs in Germany.
Do you remember what year at least these trains were going?
The trains were going in 46, and mainly in 46.
Were there any other chaplains involved with you?
There were other chaplains involved in this, sure. Lifshitz was involved, he was in Austria. Other chaplains were involved.
Did you work closely with any other chaplains?
You see, it's very hard to say we worked closely because we were, ideologically we worked closely,
right.
But we didn't work closely physically because we were in far removed different areas.
Okay, fine. Now, how would you characterize the role of the chaplains during this period from 44 to 48?
I would say it was one of the greatest opportunities for a chaplain to serve, and it was one of the, if you think in terms of mitzvahs, it was a period where whatever he did in behalf was one of the greatest mitzvahs that he could do, helping people getting back on their feet. And being rabbis, it made them feel good, and chaplains extended their stay as long as they're good. There was, for instance, Chaplain Livaza. He is now in Israel. I don't know how. Have you ever contacted him?
Yes, I've spoken to him.
You spoke to him. He was one of the DP chaplains, and I think we had an opportunity to serve, and I think most of them served. If you were to ask what would happen if chaplains hadn't been there,
Next question.
That's the next question. All right, look, things. Number one, it's an iffy question.
Okay.
Number two, you muddle through, maybe not as good, but it would have worked out too. But with chaplains, of course, it worked better for the individual.
Well, would you say that people were saved that might have died?
Absolutely, absolutely. People would have would have been saved, and people would have lost hope for the future. After all, you came across a group of people who had they had lost everything, and what was their future going to be? And if you could instill in them hope for an improved conditions, of course, that, I would say, helped them physically.
So then you definitely did provide a very important role.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Very important role, well recognized by many, and particularly recognized by the chaplain himself. He gave him a feeling of spiritual satisfaction, of having... Yeah.
Okay, so there was nothing else you wanted to say about that question. Now, we didn't deal with the second period that you were there, in 1948. And perhaps if we can, we should discuss as much as you can.
Well, you see, in 1948, in 1948 and 49, I was in Munich. Now, Munich at that time had already a Jewish community.
Well, this was after the State of Israel, the establishment of the State of Israel?
Yes.
All right, fine.
In other words, they had already communities. I forgot the name, but there's one man in Bavaria who then later on committed suicide. I don't know, Auerbach, that's the name, anything? Yeah, and he was commissar for the DPs in the Bavarian state, and the relationships became more, let's say, more normal and more organized, and the individual chaplain couldn't do as much anymore as he could in the period of 45 and 46, where things were very much in fluid, and things weren't as organized as they were in 48 and 49. 48 and 49, you had already German government. Still, you had military government above German government, but again, I mean, the tendency was always to impose the responsibilities more and more upon the Germans themselves. Frankly speaking, I would say that we made a big mistake. The United States made a big mistake in 1945 when they established the tribunal to judge the war criminals, the big war criminals. At that time, if the Allies had turned over these war criminals to the Germans would have made much quicker end that the Americans did. And so we spent a lot of time and money and getting at the big fish, whereas the little guys they got away. Had we turned over, because the Germans at that time, of course, 45 were very bitter against the people who had misled them, and they would have made tabula rasa with them much quicker than we have this way. We still have a fellow like Hess sitting in Berlin, and I think we would have done better, but it's the American love for order and law which prompted that.
Yes. Now, I wanted to ask you, is there any area that I have not touched on that you feel should be discussed? I'm going to turn it over.
Yeah.